Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Xenia Kounalaki. I'm foreign editor with the Athens-based Kathimerini newspaper, and I'll be moderating our roundtable. The problem of this panel is that time is very limited. We only have 60 minutes, and we are 7 people, so everyone has like 5 nanoseconds to speak. So I ask all of you, please, to be very brief in your answers so we can squeeze some debate afterwards. So our topic is macroeconomic stability. Is Greece finally on a sustainable growth path? Before we start, I kindly ask Nikos Vettas, who's the General Director of the Foundation for Economic and Industrial Research, AUEB, to show us some slides, to give us some interesting insight on growth, unemployment, and a few more data since 1981, when Greece joined the EU.
Okay, thank you. Just so that we have a basis for the discussion, without any aspirations for interpretation. First thing, if you try to trace the average GDP growth rate per year from 1981, when Greece then joined what was called the European Economic Community, you can see that if you subtract inflation, there were some negative years, some positive years. Greece grew a lot in the years around joining the Eurozone, but also with higher foreign debt. Then it was the crisis years. Then it was the pandemic, very volatile, this whole thing. The average growth rate during all of these years was slightly less than 1%. For Greece to be on stable ground from now on, this 1% is not enough. It has to be at least 2%. Second slide is on the 2 main factors for production, which is labor and capital. On the left side, you see the unemployment rate, which was actually high even during the good years. It was around 10% pre-2008. Then it skyrocketed to almost 30%. At the heart of the crisis, and gradually is now converging towards 10%. On the right, you can see investment. Investment has actually collapsed during the crisis years. It has been steadily recovering, but it's still far below the EU average and the pre-crisis years. Final slide as data. On the left, you can see the current account. Fixing the current account problem was a major success during the 3 successive programs. You see that it was very much fixed, but then first with COVID and the collapse of tourism, then with the energy prices, it appears that it is re-emerging perhaps. And on the right, you can actually see the Greek public debt, which has been stabilized, but it's still there. So these are some facts that we thought would help the discussion. Thank you.
Julia Lendvai is head of unit at the Directorate-General for Economic and Financial Affairs in the European Commission. I give the floor to Julia. So she could give us the European perspective on the current situation. I guess you know the data Nikos showed us. What do you make of the current situation and Moody's decision not to maintain Greece outside the investment grade states?
Okay, I have seen that it's...
I think it's on. The light is...
Okay.
So it's okay.
Okay, thanks. First of all, thanks, Nikos. These are very useful data to start my presentation. And I wanted to start by saying that Greece has really come a long way since the financial crisis, and a very significant number of important reforms have been implemented across a huge array of areas, including some which I didn't even know about before I started to work on Greece. And this has helped to stabilize or reduce flow imbalances by the end of the program, which of course need to be safeguarded, and now Nikos has shown us a bit how this is going. And also the crisis unfortunately left Greece with very large stock imbalances, which take a long time to resolve. Now, nevertheless, during this crisis that Nikos pointed to, pandemic, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, current flare-up of Middle East crisis, Greece has shown a remarkable resilience, actually, which is nevertheless the result of all these efforts of the past decade. So all the effort and pain was at last not in vain. Also, thanks, not last, thanks to the nominal growth in the past couple of years, finally these large stock imbalances have started to reduce at a faster pace. So public debt is now, or was at the end of last year, at around 160%, down from 207 at its peak in 2020. Net external liabilities are down by 30 percentage points from their peak in 2020 and are around 140%. Now, this is more thanks to the use of the Hercules asset protection scheme. The non-performing loans of banks have been reduced from a staggering 42% in 2016 to around 5.5% in September 23. And the unemployment rate has also come down remarkably from its peak 27%, which was in 2013, I think, and it's now around 10%. So all this is very good news, and this is also well reflected in market sentiment towards Greece, okay, so you asked me why Moody's has not upgraded Greece. I would stress that 3 other rating agencies have upgraded Greece to investment grade, and even Moody's made a step of 2 notches in last September. So actually, I don't think it was to be expected that another rating decision would come as early as now. But actually they have given a very, very useful explanation, which I also have built into these, the points that I'm going to make now. And also one important point also about market sentiment, the Greek sovereign spread has come down by 300 basis points over the last 5 years. It's now, since the beginning of last year, below that of Italy, and it's now approaching that of Spain. So I think all this is remarkable. And entering a virtuous circle in itself is a very positive development for Greece. Now, despite all this very good news, I would still say that there is no room for complacency for Greece, because there is also another way at looking at these numbers, unfortunately. So 160% public debt is still the highest in the EU. 140% net external liabilities is still the highest in the EU. Actually, even the 5.7% non-performing loans of banks is the highest in the EU, but this is combined with 32% of GDP non-performing loans that are still out in the economy and are now held by servicers, not the banks. So this is still weighing on the economy, and even the unemployment rate is the 2nd highest in the EU, and it is now coupled with labor market shortages, which suggest that these people are difficult to employ. So there are still imbalances which continue to expose Greece to external shocks, and this in an increasingly volatile international environment. And the challenges in reducing these stock imbalances are reflecting the remaining structural imbalances. The structural challenges that Greece continues to face. And for a faster pace of reduction, I would argue that Greece needs to increase its productivity, which is still far lagging behind its peers and other member states, although, again, it has started to improve, so let's acknowledge these improvements, but there is still much scope for improvement at this. Now, just some calculations. At Greece's current potential growth, there is no convergence to EU average, actually, because it is at the EU average potential growth. If Greece is growing for the next years over the long term at 2%, and the EU continues growing at 1% at its potential, it will take 45 years for Greece to catch up with the EU average. So this is this is a very long period. So improving this would be extremely helpful for catching up and also to get rid of the stock imbalances. And actually, there is not much news, unfortunately, in what I can say what needs to be done. It's continuing with the implementation of structural reforms in all the areas that have been started. This is business environment, stabilizing the regulatory framework, continuing reforms of public administration, justice, public procurement, cadastre, completion of cadastre, accelerating the transfer of property rights. All these are badly needed. And this would not only help productivity and growth, it would also help broaden the export base, which we have seen the relatively high current account deficit. So the export of Greece is still concentrated in basically two large sectors, which is tourism and shipping, which is very much exposed to international developments and fluctuations. So broadening this would help maintain this, and reducing import dependence. And it would also help, actually, these reforms would help also with the reduction of non-performing loans. And finally, I would also stress what also Nikos showed, human capital investment, education, healthcare, improving skills, match between labor demand, labor supply. All this would be very helpful, and increasing labor market participation in a country where female employment is only 50%, which is extremely low. Now, let me still conclude on a positive note. The reforms in all these areas are still ongoing, and including under the Recovery and Resilience Facility that I'm working on also together with the Greek authorities, and we have seen very constructive cooperation over the past years, and I hope that this will continue. And the Recovery and Resilience Facility and other EU instruments are also supporting, of course, investments which are badly needed, including in green, digital transition. This can also all help to increase productivity. And we stand ready to support the Greek authorities to complete these efforts. Thanks.
Philippos Sachinidis was a Minister of Finance, and he's a candidate for in the upcoming elections for PASOK. Good luck in your candidacy. What do you think, what do you make of Julia's assessment? Is the glass half full or half empty?
First of all, let me thank the organizers for their kind invitation, and both Nikos, Vettas and Julia for their views expressed about the current stance of the Greek economy. Well, the recent press release from Elstat unveiled government's optimism over 2023 growth rate. They were forecasting a growth rate of 2.4%, and the actual was 2%. And the main reason was investment underperformance, mainly due to delays and postponement in the absorption of RRF funds in 2023. So, knowing the problems that we are facing, the big question is, with regard to our future prospects, is what are the main challenges? And I think that despite all these reforms that took place over the recent years, still we are based on a poor and ineffective production model based mainly on consumption rather than on private investment. And if we pay attention to the composition of investment, we will realize that it is directed in non-productive activities, mainly real estate and tourism. Although I don't want to denounce tourism, still we are quite sensitive if we rely heavily on proceeds from tourism. If there is something that we have to work on, is try to manage and mobilize capital to more extrovert sectors. I think that this is a task that we are working how many years? Over the last 10, 20, 12 years? And in areas such as high-tech, startups related to artificial intelligence or green technology. These are the sectors that can bring more added value in the economy. We have to fill the investment gap. We are talking about approximately 100 billion euros, right? This is a very, very large investment gap. And we should also pay attention to the appropriate composition of investment plans. Now, I think that we are facing a major issue. Over the last 4 years, the current account deficit was well above 6% of GDP. And I think that this is a clear indication that there is still a big problem. And I mention this because at the moment, we don't have a fiscal deficit as it used to be the case in 2007 or 2008 or 2009. Just to remind you, the current account deficit in 2007 and 2008, it was approximately 14.5% of GDP, and at the same time we had a fiscal deficit that was close to somewhere between 8 and 15% of GDP. Now we have a current account deficit that is at 6% of GDP, but we have a primary surplus of approximately 2% of GDP for 2024. So at the same time, we can see that savings are falling month by month. And this, it is a signal that we have to pay attention because it indicates the possibility of lack of domestic funds to finance private investment. We still rely heavily on imports, and our exports have a low content of technology. Now, with regard to Moody's assessment, I would argue that there are two fair points apart of the points mentioned by Julia. And I think the first one is that we still rely heavily on proceeds from tourism, and we have, it is quite clear that tourism is subject both to climate crisis and pandemic crisis. So I think that it is more appropriate to have a more symmetric economy. And the second one is that I think that there is a reform fatigue. I'm not pretty sure whether the government of New Democracy is ready to go faster with regard to the necessary reforms. So these are the main challenges that we have to address if we want to answer to the criticism raised by Moody's.
Elias Lekkos is Chief Economist at the Piraeus Bank. Do you agree that we heavily rely on tourism and this is a huge problem for the prospects of the Greek economy or not?
Not really. I mean, we have a competitive advantage on that specific sector, and we should carry on building on that competitive advantage. Trying to sort of respond to what everybody else has said up until now, I think that there are two issues. I think there is the issue of where we stand right now and where we are heading regarding the Greek economy. I'm very optimistic about where we're going. I'm very optimistic about the future because I think that the future, despite what everybody seems to be thinking, we're moving to the right direction. And we are moving to the right direction because there are two major forces pushing the Greek economy towards reform. The first one is foreign capital. Despite what the foreign official statistics will tell you, there is a wall of money not coming to Greece that has already come to Greece. And this money transforms specific sectors of the Greek economy. The foreign investment is transforming the tourism sector because we see a lot of investment in five-star hotels. We see a lot of foreign brands coming to Greece. The logistics sector, I think that down the line, 5-10 years down the line, Greece can be a serious regional logistics hub. It is transforming the pharmaceutical sector. It is transforming the healthcare sector. It is transforming this data center or the general technology ICT sector. It is transforming the infrastructure sector. And also we see substantial investment heading towards the agricultural sector or even the manufacturing. So despite the fact that we don't see the fruits of that investment right now, I think the transformation is there. The other factor that is transforming the Greek economy is the RRF. If we kind of make the mental leap and try to imagine What will be the impact of the RRF in Greece 15 years from now? I think that the impact will be on the RRF transforming Greece into a regional energy hub. That will be the clear impact of the RRF on the Greek economy. Greece is being transformed into a regional transportation hub, you know, with cables from linking North Africa, Israel, to the rest of Europe. We are becoming a renewable energy hub on ourselves, and I think that the renewable energy story will be transformative for the Greek economy. Everybody, both Nikos and Philippos, they talked about the current account deficit. Well, each year we pay 8 billion to import natural gas, electricity and oil. If we manage to balance that account by 2032, then that's a solution, an easy solution to the current account deficit. So, and at the same time, it gives you strategic autonomy, it's good for the environment, etc., etc. So I think that we're moving. We may not see the fruits right now, and we may want faster pace, but the future, I think we're moving to the right direction. Where I would put a question mark is for the here and now, because there is quite a lot of complacency right now, because as Mr. Tsakonas mentioned in the previous panel, we're growing at 2%, everybody's at 0, so we should be happy. And I don't think that we should be happy. I think that we should be aiming for much higher growth rate. If you look at the data, and there is a very big question mark about the data, but if we take the data at face value, on the second half, Q3, Q4 of last year, the Greek economy went down a couple of gears. There are two possible explanations about that. First is that the Greek consumer, because it was, he or she was facing a loss in disposable income, reduced consumption. That's one reason. And the second reason, and here I will agree with Mr. Sachinidis, is that the implementation of the RRF is below par. It's something that we suspected at the end of last year. We discussed it internally at Piraeus Bank at the beginning of this year, but now the cat is out of the bag. According to the official data, everybody in this room knows that RRF is 18 billion of grants, 18 billion of loans. On the grants, we have spent only 5 at best, and on the loans, which is something of a responsibility of the private sector and the banks, here in this room, it was mentioned that we have spent only 2 billion. So out of the 36, we have managed to disperse at best, because I think that the true number is lower than that, 7 billion. So that underperformance is the second main driver for low growth in 2023. Now, why I'm bothered about 2023? Because I think it will have very big implications, and with that I will stop, for 2024. Q4 growth wasn't 2%, it was 1.2. So Q4 2023, Q4 2022, it was 1.2. So that is the speed of growth that we are entering 2024. So in order to get to something like 2% growth for this year, it will require a huge amount of effort from everybody else. We at Piraeus Bank, we had a 3.4% growth for this year. We have lowered that to 2.1%, but I think that from the first quarter onwards, the risk is, and my fear is, that we will be seeing growth rates closer to 1% rather than 2%. Q1 is going to be okay-ish, but from Q2 onwards, I think that we will be seeing a substantial slowdown in the growth rate. So my fear is that we might be sleepwalking into a slowdown for this year. Thank you.
Dimitris Valatsas is chief economist at Aurora Macro Strategies in the USA. Sometimes Greeks based abroad have a clearer vision of what's happening in the country than we have. Do you share the optimism or do you think, are you more critical seeing the big picture?
Thank you very much. I don't know if I have a clearer vision, but I do have a more optimistic vision, which is what you're supposed to import from the United States. So I'll start there. I want to make two major points, kind of addressing what the panelists mentioned before. Point number one is you can't have growth without growing your debt. If you want investments, if you want assets on the ground, you've got to create liabilities somewhere. Now, unfortunately for Greece, the fiscal space is not where those liabilities are going to be created. It doesn't have the capacity to do that and definitely shouldn't do that for all the reasons that both the fellow panelists and the prior 6 panels have mentioned. But you got to have leverage. And I think that will be done with the private sector. That will show up in household indebtedness, that will show up in corporate indebtedness, that will show up in the current account deficit. I mean, you got to import capital from somewhere, right? And that's going to show up. So you can't love investment and hate debt. It doesn't work. If you want to grow, you need to grow the debt pile as well. That's lesson number one that I think people need to take home. I wouldn't worry too much about what Moody's says about the debt and the country and this. Moody's generally tells you what happened in spreads over the past 3 years, and you can find that out much more easily than waiting for a ratings agency. That's part one. Part two is that, for better or for worse, Greece is in the European Union, is in the Eurozone, so growth policy is basically Europe policy for the vast majority of economic activity happening here. There's some structural issue that we'll get to in a bit, but on the major things, both cyclical and structural, you rely on the European Union for growth. Now, that comes with bad news and good news. The bad news is that the European Union is a low-growth part of the world, one of the lowest growth parts of the world. And part of that is a choice. It's a policy choice. You have fiscal contraction in the middle of a recession, and you have, in my view, unnecessary monetary policy contraction also in the middle of a recession. You have some of the major players with fiscal space, Germany, the Netherlands, lowering their deficits, in some places even closing out the deficits, thanks to judicial decisions and the like, and that's not helpful. So you're trapped in this kind of low growth world, and that's a problem. The good news is that Greece and Greek politicians have been extraordinarily good at what we'd call in America getting some pork spending. So going to Brussels and bringing home the bacon. Sorry to be mixing metaphors here, but as both panelists and the previous panel mentioned, Greece's share of NGEU is the highest as a percent of GDP of any member state. That's fantastic. Keep doing that. Keep going to Brussels. Keep getting money coming here. That's essential. Now, I did want to mention, and I think, from what I see here, there's good reason to be optimistic. The reforms on things that people have mentioned, like education, that's going ahead. Education reform, it's been difficult for Greek governments to do that over decades, but they're succeeding in doing it now. Immigration reform, very few people have mentioned that, but if you want to grow, one of the easiest ways to grow is to import people, import labor in addition to capital. That's been going ahead, so that's pretty great news. And the investment framework, I think just looking at it from the United States seems to be a lot better. Everyone's very happy investing in Greece, has no concerns about regulatory, legal, and all these other issues that we've had to face over the past 15 years. So if I had to summarize everything into one message, is to stop worrying about indebtedness, stop worrying about leverage. You need leverage. You need leverage to get to growth, and learn to love growth.
Elias Papaioannou is Professor of Economics, the London Business School in the UK. What's your take on everything you've heard up to now?
So thank you, Xenia. Thank you, Nico, for your kind invitation. Can you hear me now? Thank you for your kind invitation. So let me start with a caveat. My remarks will be based on 3 things. I'm teaching now at the London Business School a course called the World Economy. And then I have not been following much the Greek economics in the past couple of years, so I was digging in my computer trying to find an old presentation. And the first thing that popped out was a presentation I did while I was working at Dartmouth College in the States back in 2008. And then my dear friend Philippos sent me some statistics, and I tried to check the statistics as reported by the Bank of Greece, and I found many similarities. So let me start with history and try to conclude with the future. So you can pick your year 2004 when we had the famous Greek Olympics. You can pick 2007 when we had the devastating fires. Pick any year you like. It's your call. At that time, Greece had growth well in excess of the steady growth, which is roughly speaking 2%. One of the most remarkable patterns of economic growth is that since we measure it in the United States, growth in the so-called frontier is around 2%. So if you want to catch up, to converge, you have to grow for a period for more than 2%. So if I was to start, actually, let me reverse from the future. If now the Greek society, the Greek political parties, the Greek business people have an implicit agreement that we will keep growing in the next 10 to 15 years at a rate of, roughly speaking, 1.5, 2.5, then you're explicitly saying that the gaps vis-a-vis the US, vis-a-vis Japan, are going to be exactly what they are as we speak. Now let me go back to the, if you like, historical kind of narrative, because as I'm a researcher, I guess the only one here, let me try to also pinpoint what we know. Well, we know that what Greece experienced in the 2000s, also Spain, Portugal, other countries kind of experience. An investment boom at the time, which we are not seeing today. A lot of the investment boom at the time, and of course investment boom means a lot of it was funded from abroad. In the 2000s, it was debt. Actually, the positive news for Greece today is that it is mostly equity, or relatively speaking, we have more equity finance today as we used to have in the 2004, let's say 2007. Now, what are the more alarming news and similarities? Low savings at the time and very high consumption. Low savings, super low savings, actually very high levels of consumption. The latest report of last Monday of the governor of the Bank of Greece suggests that 3/4 of growth in Greece of the past couple of years has been growth. So going back to the previous remark, it seems that a country that is running a current account deficit by definition imports capital. Well, this capital is not so much in five-star hotels, although we really like to party and, you know, have fun in the five-star hotels, but it's mostly on the consumption side. I'm afraid that's the data. Now, what we know a lot also about the 2000s is that a lot of growth, not only in Greece, but in the periphery of Europe, was mainly in what economists coin as non-tradables. So think about hotels, think about tourism, think about real estate, which actually displaced investments and investments in R&D in the tradable sectors. So there has been like a lot of work. Actually, the second in command of the International Monetary Fund, Gita Gopinath, has a very interesting paper documenting this across all European countries. So now, if again look at the recent data, most of the growth tends to come from hotels. It's like a bundle, it's a very big category, at least on the aggregate statistics of construction. So I guess we are also nowadays also experiencing this source of misallocation. On the positive news, deficit is not as large of the central government as it used to be, of course, at the time, which was part of the disaster, to use a mild word, at the time. But let me pinpoint some other aspects that we know pretty well from research, and politicians and business people in the room should take the lesson. At the time, the markets were parting. Greek governments, the predecessors of our panelists, could go in the market and borrow almost as cheaply as France and Germany. Oh, fantastic news, one could have said back in 2003, 2004. Second, the European Commission, and I understand there's no Julia's front, was turning a blind eye. I saw Mr. Almunia walking out. I think it's fair to say that he didn't do his due diligence at the time. So I just want to be more on the cautious side. Obviously, there are, in a country, and let me turn to the future looking part, what I hear many politicians, and Julia, in some sense, perhaps I'm misreading you here. There is an argument I hear often oh, Greece, what do you expect? After 10 years of an economic downturn, we are growing now at 2%. What do you want? Perhaps 2.5% will be better, perhaps a bit more investment on tradable sector. But actually, the argument is exactly the other way around. If you go to the standard PhD course in macro, and you tell that the country capital gets depleted, gets destroyed, World War II, capital got destroyed. That's how we teach neoclassical growth. Boom in Western Europe in investment. Where in a country that after 10 to 12 years of an economic Armageddon, we do not see an investment boom, and we see foreigners investing in Greece in non-tradables and consumption. So this is on the investment side, and turning to productivity and conclude with that, because in the long run, productivity is what matters. The news from what are the proxies of competitiveness? The current account. I understand, Elias and the predecessors, that look, it's not necessarily the full picture. True, but the current account does include the receipts from tourism. It does include the receipts from shipping, and it happens that shipping has a good year. Who knows how things will turn out in the future? So if I was to look on the first proxy of competitiveness, the current account, the situation is alarming. If I was to look at wage or price inflation, clearly Greece is higher than other kind of countries that were in the same kind of group. Soft indicators of public sector, some improvements in some indicators, some deterioration in some other indicator. Soft indicators about managerial practices, because in the end jobs and investment will be done by the private sector. Not so great for Greek business people, despite celebrations for ridiculously good startups. So, mapped with the massive deleterious reallocation that we are observing, again, towards non-tradables. From tradables, I think that people here, not to be pessimistic by no means, but we should not enter the age of diminishing expectations. Thank you.
Peter Spiegel is the US managing editor for the Financial Times. I consider him to be half Greek.
So do I.
He's been following the Greek crisis forever. He knows everything. Do you agree with the professor of doom before you? Are we entering hasta con macaronada pasta with lobster territory? Or?
The problem is Elias and I had lunch, and I told him what I was going to say, and he stole half of my lines. Let me first of all say, I've been here now for 3 days. It's my 8th, I think, Delphi forum. Every panel I go to seems to be doom and gloom. Putin is going to win in Ukraine. The environment is collapsing. Donald Trump is going to win in the US. Let's just start to say, we had a dinner the other night. I call it the, every year we get together, I call it the Greek Crisis Alumni Association. And we were all, I mean, I think we have to realize where we came from. And I think sometimes it's lost in these conversations. And Julia, you mentioned it. I mean, it is amazing that a country that was in free fall, complete and utter free fall, is now basically, the conversation we're having on the table is a conversation about a normal Eurozone country and the challenges it's facing in its economy. And that in and of itself is a major achievement. So let's just acknowledge that. However, I do want to associate myself to a certain extent with what Elias said, because the whole point of what this country went through, the program, the internal devaluation, even trying to get Moody's to rank your sovereign debt as investable, the whole point of that is to clear space for the private sector. So I would somewhat disagree with the point about go to Brussels and get more money. It's great, but Greece cannot rely on public sector spending for growth. That's the mistake in the past, and it is great that the government has been achieving success in Brussels, getting the money and investing in it, but when and until you see investment, FDI in Greece, in the sectors you were talking about, it can't just be tourism, it can't just be shipping. It has to, we have to see some diversification of this economy. And Sternaris said it, I think, in that same report that Elias was referring to, it is this issue that Europe is always struggling with, which is competitiveness. The point of the program was to bring down wages and internal devaluation so that Greece becomes more competitive in the private sector. The whole point of getting investment rated sovereign bonds is so the private sector can borrow money at cheaper rates and invest. And then, so that's why I would associate myself with Elias. The slides that Nikos put up that I thought were most important were the investment gap and the current account deficit. We have not seen private investment come to where it should be right now. And in many ways, I do think it has to do with structural issues that have to do with the way this economy is structured, but also I think in even in anecdotal ways, the way Greeks view their economy. I'll give you one of my favorite sectors, which is the agriculture sector, right? I like to eat. First time I was in Greece, I think I've gained 25 pounds. Why is it in New York I can buy Italian olive oil and Spanish olive oil, but I cannot find Greek olive oil? Because it's small producers in the Peloponnese who will not work together to create bigger companies to export. Same thing with Greek wine, same thing with Greek honey. So even in a place where Greece clearly has an economic advantage, it is not scaling. There are structural issues that prevent that from becoming a strong export market. I could go on. The point I would just say is the debate we're having here around this table is a debate that is going on in several Eurozone economies about Europe's lack of competitiveness in a global market, which is a debate that is very different than we had 5-10 years ago in Greece. And to me, that is a sign of optimism. The sign that we're having a debate about a normal Eurozone economy and how it can grow in the future, to me, is a great achievement. And I think that is the signal thing that we have to remember. Thank you.
Philippos has a question for Elias.
Yes, I was a little bit surprised with regard to his comments with regard to the current account deficit. So I'm concerned, although the higher energy prices have been phased out, the current account deficit is still well above the so-called sustainable current account deficit. How do you explain that? 6%, and the prices, energy prices, well below what it used to be 2 years ago?
Yeah, but I think Dimitris made this comment before. If you really want growth, if you want to grow through investment, you really need to import capital goods. Greece is not a producer of capital goods. If we want to build a new metro line, a very big chunk of that will be imported capital goods. If we really want to build a renewable energy industry, we really need to import the wind turbines and the solar panels. The issue for me is whether you spend it on consumption or on investment, because the investment will sort of take care of funding these future obligations that you build. And the second, this is where I will disagree with the professor, is that we have a current account deficit. It was 6%, 6.5% last year, 10% the year before. And yet, nobody's borrowing. In theory, if you have a current account deficit, you need to borrow from abroad. Well, the public sector is not borrowing, households are definitely not borrowing, and all the companies are borrowing is through RRF or stuff like that. Right. Which means that as we speak, the current account deficits are being financed by equity inflows. These are not recorded because of various reasons as foreign direct investments, but I'll take you to my starting point, that as we speak, there is a huge amount of money coming to Greece in the form of equity and is being invested. And I'm happy to see, investment in hotels. It's still a productive, investment. And how can we accommodate more tourists if we don't invest in hotels and sort of hospitality infrastructure? So this is why, if we don't borrow to finance consumption, and if we don't raise salaries and pensions, then growth will, for an economy like Greece, growth will mean a current account deficit.
Well, I'm not disagreeing. Some clarifications. First of all, countries have grown without borrowing from abroad. Actually, the so-called East Asian tiger economies, which like growth lecture number 2, grew when their economies were closed. So there is no necessity to borrow from abroad. As I mentioned before, on the positive side, the current account deficit of the past couple of years have been mainly financed with debt, and less so, by equity, and less so than debt, which was the norm in the period that preceded the crisis. And let me just mention something and make it abundantly clear. Nobody is against investments in hotel or so-called non-tradable sectors. But as Peter mentioned, this is a country that implemented the most severe austerity programs that the world has ever seen, coupled with institutional reforms, product market reforms, labor market, the banks had to be recapitalized with money of people in this room, actually. And then, after 11, 12 years, it's not the boom that you would expect. You know, Nico, perhaps in your next slide, you have to put South Korea or Taiwan after the East Asian financial crisis. There's a crisis and then there's like a boom. In Greece, you don't expect that. And I'm very forceful on that, being a Greek of the diaspora, but for good or bad reasons, spending some time here, mostly bad. It is really sad if the outcome is that, okay, because we suffered the worst depression since the Great Depression, it is fine the next 10 years to grow 2% because Four Seasons will build another hotel in Mykonos.
Julia?
Yeah, I would just like to make one point. Well, first of all, I never said that 2% of growth was high enough. I said 2% growth would allow convergence to Euro average or EU average in 45 years, which I find extremely long. So, no, but what I wanted to say is that actually, if you look at surveys of obstacles or bottlenecks for investment, first point that will emerge is still too much administrative burden. Second point, judicial, too slow. And third point, access to finance. Now, access to finance, let's hope it will improve through the investment grade. There is also this on-lending program under the RRF, which is huge, and it's actually, I don't know who said that it was going behind schedule, it's actually going ahead of schedule. It's true that the true disbursements from these loan contracts will come over many years, so that's true, but the program is going very well, so I hope that helps.
Dimitris, you wanted to say something?
Just to touch on a couple points and my fellow panelists made. I mean, I totally agree on access to finance, but access to finance means more debt. You don't, you know, what are you going to do with the finance if you don't borrow to invest? So I'd press this point home. Like, you need to borrow to invest. There's no other way to get out of this. Unless you become some, you know, export giant, which I don't think Greece is about to become. I'm surprised you think of hotel rooms as non-tradable. I think, you know, Greece trades hotel rooms in an international market and, you know, closes the current account. You know.
If I said I misspoke, I just made the point that trade in services is part of the current account, and right. Despite Greece having such record years in tourism, still it records a deficit hovering around 6 to 10 percentage points of GDP.
Fair point, fair point. I just want to say, like, you know, even from a, you know, external perspective, investing in hotels can be a good thing, can close the current account. You know, Hawaii used to export pineapples. It didn't get rich from pineapples, it got rich from hotels, right? Peter, I'm going to put a word in for Whole Foods Tribeca. You can actually find Whole Foods branded Greek olive oil in Whole Foods Tribeca. I'm sure Whole Foods Wall Street doesn't have it, but Tribeca does. But, you know, and more broadly on your point on the EU, I think the EU has changed since Greece faced this crisis, and to some extent European policy forced Greece into a crisis. I think NGEU showed that. I think the common fiscal response to COVID showed that. Hopefully a common fiscal response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine will show that. And hopefully we're closer to a model where we are going to have to care about Greece's current account deficit the same way we care about Florida's current account deficit. We don't think about it. It doesn't matter.
Peter, do you want to step in?
Well, I still want to agree with Elias on this. I mean, obviously, we should not look down our nose on the tourism industry. It is the engine for growth in this country. But it is still striking to me, there's been a lot of talk about the pharmaceutical industry in particular. Nice having a CEO of Pfizer who happens to be a member of the Greek diaspora, and so he can invest in Thessaloniki. It would be nice to see sectors other than shipping and tourism become engines for growth. Yes, Philippos, I would agree with your point about this. And to Elias's point, I am somewhat surprised we have not seen, given all the structural reforms that have happened over the last 10 years, that we have not seen growth and investment in pick the sector. I mean, I'm not here, so I don't see what's on. Now, the one thing I will say is anecdotally, and I was talking to Thomas Fieser, who people probably remember as the head of the Euro working group in Brussels during the crisis, and I made the same point to him, and he was arguing that any country you look at, that is, you start with anecdote and then it becomes data, and he feels that if you look anecdotally around the Greek economy, you start seeing pockets of startups, of investment generators, you're starting to see places in the country where this is starting to happen. It just hasn't happened yet. I hope that's true. But I am surprised, as Elias' point, it hasn't happened yet, because we are at the point where you should be seeing that V jump, and it just hasn't happened yet.
Can I just There is a very simple explanation. There is a very simple explanation. You mentioned about Korea. Korea was a 2-year shock. In Greece, it was a 15-year crisis. So you have a massive hysteresis event. You know, the labor force, yes.
I agree the hysteresis.
Turn on your mic.
I agree with the hysteresis part, but you yourself said before that the forecast is for even weaker growth in the years to come.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that was a very big disappointment. I agree with you that, you know, we had a forecast of 3.4%, and that was predicated upon two factors. One was the reversal of the terms of trade shock, which has happened because we paid 10 billion from 22 to 23. We paid 10 billion less for importing energy, and that is a question mark because it has not been reflected on GDP data. But the second driver of growth was the RRF. And there we expected a much faster implementation. There are 2 years left of the RRF. And out of the 36 billion, we have at best absorbed something close to 6. And I'm being generous with my calculations. So that's what's missing. You know, public sector investment spending would be an excellent way to run an economy hot and basically run a reverse hysteresis kind of, and it hasn't happened, and I fully agree that we should be aiming, at least for the next 3-4 years, for growth rates above 3%. 3.2, 3.4, we're not going to argue. But that was our view regarding the Greek economy. And I'm really worried that, you know, we self-congratulate ourselves because we had 2% and everybody else is 0. So we see somebody who is sort of dying and we say, oh, we're healthy. It's not, we're healthier than him, but, you know, we should be aiming and we should be aspiring for more.
Philippos, so you want to explain why you rolled your eyes?
Well, I mean, my main concern is what our growth rate will be after RRF. Most international organizations are forecasting that the average growth rate after maybe over the next 10 years, it is going to be somewhere close to 1%. And 1% of GDP, 1% annual growth rate is not sufficient to solve out our main problems. So I'm really concerned whether we will be able, after RRF, to achieve something better than 1%.
Yeah, I can tell you my sort of 5 cents of philosophy. Yes, growth in Greece is exactly what Nikos Vettas showed. In the past, from the 60s up until now, we had 0.9% growth. And in order to get not to 2%, and we're talking about trend, yes, because we have a set of structural tailwinds, Greece should be aiming for 3.something% growth over the next 5 to 7 years. After that, growth should be sort of declining to something more sustainable. Now, what's sustainable? If you look at the last debt sustainability report from the European Commission, the European Commission staff forecast something like 0.7% growth, not for Greece, for everybody in the Eurozone. That happens because you treat demographics as destiny.
Yep.
And I think Dimitris, from using his US perspective, has touched upon that. We really need more immigration. If you ask me what's a very good trend growth for Greece, that's 1.4%. 0.9% productivity, 0.5% population growth. And that can come only through sustainable and well-organized legal immigration.
So, in fact, what you are arguing is that we need, as soon as possible, an immigration strategy, all right? And there is no immigration strategy.
Yesterday.
We are talking about immigration strategy over the last probably 20 years, and still we are lacking one.
Otherwise, we are doomed to something close to 0.7% like everybody else in Europe.
Sorry, guys, we're running out of time. I ask Nikos to wrap up the discussion.
Okay, gladly. One thing, as Peter said, this is not 2010, this is not 2013, this is not 2016. So it's not just thanks God, Felipe, it's thanks to a lot of people, including you, by the way. Now we are talking about how fast Greece can converge. However, the fact that we all want Greece to converge doesn't guarantee that it will. One can make the analog also with the United States. There are some states that are systematically lagging behind. They're losing any capital, they're losing people, they're still part of the US, and they may be living on net transfers. On the more positive side, however, and I'm going to stop the wrap-up here because we do have a second part of this discussion starting in a minute where we're going to go deeper into the engine and the production model of the Greek economy. Greece is not necessarily what is currently within its geographical limits. There are Greeks abroad. There are non-Greeks that should be attracted to Greece. There is a huge diaspora thanks to good and bad reasons. There is Greek shipping, there is international recognition. Greece could become a hub, and under those conditions, perhaps this 2% could go to 4%. But there are conditions for capital and for people to want to be in Greece and not elsewhere. Thanks, Xenia.
I want to thank the speakers for keeping the tight schedule and the audience for staying for the next roundtable.